I guess I could have queued past that. Yeah, this is an excerpt from a Christian and Muslim dialogue.
So I do have a short statement to say before we begin timing. And this would be to, I would like to begin by saying that as a Muslim, it is my duty and responsibility to engage with our Jewish and Christian brethren in a respectful, kind, and responsible manner. Tonight, you may hear me disagree with the Old Testament and the New Testament, but please, I ask that you do not confuse these disagreements with hatred. We are gathered here today to examine and understand relationships between the Old Testaments, the New Testaments, and the Quran. So I will begin now, inshallah. Okay, so to begin with, just so we can get this rolling, Old Testament does not mean Torah, New Testament does not mean Injil.
Now, I want to stop right there, because this has come up recently with other Muslims who have accused me of being inconsistent, pulling the wool over people's eyes, you know, all the rest of this kind of stuff. Ijaz didn't do that, but others have. When we try to explain to non-Muslims what the Quran means when it talks about the Torah and the Injil, because the Quran does not use the term Old Testament or New Testament, Hebrew scriptures versus Greek scriptures. And I believe we are on very firm ground to, in light of the fact that Islam comes after Judaism and after Christianity, historically speaking. You can argue that the people before them were all Muslims all you want. Historically, the first people in history come out of Arabia in the mid to late 7th century in our reckoning, 1st century in yours, but and they're the first Muslims. And the Quran is not known by anyone until same time period. And so what that means is that you will assume that the author of the Quran gets everything correct, gets everything right. Obviously, it's your ultimate authority. That's your presupposition. That's not our presupposition. And since you come last, and since your text does make reference to Christians and Jews and specifically addresses them, I believe that it is absolutely necessary that you establish some kind of meaningful foundation for what the words of the Quran were supposed to mean to the people to whom they were originally addressed. Not how they've been interpreted in light of the Sunnah, in light of development of Islamic theology for hundreds of years down the road. What did those words mean to the original people to whom they were addressed? And so if you are positing a prophet living in Mecca or Medina, depending on which surah we're talking about, addressing the people of the gospel as Christians, because it says, do not say three. Who else would that be addressing? You're talking to Christians. What did they understand by the word Injil? Or are you saying that the Quran is going to use language that would not have had any meaning whatsoever to the people to whom it was addressed? That they were just empty words, not meant to actually communicate anything at all. Same thing with the Jews. Is it possible? Can you understand why it would appear to those of us who do not share your pre-commitment to the infallibility and authority of the Quran? It seems that it'd be an appropriate thing to ask the question, what level of accurate knowledge did the author of the Quran have of the Hebrew scriptures and of the Christian scriptures? And when you ask that question, immediately when you see the Quran addressing the stories of the Hebrew scriptures, there is a mixture between what is canonical, what was actually a part of the Hebrew scriptures, and what was not. There are numerous stories taken as fact by the author of the Quran that are a part of Jewish lore and Jewish mysticism and that are not historical by any stretch of the imagination. But the Quran takes them in that way. And so how good was the author of the Quran's knowledge? You may say, Allah is the author of the Quran, therefore it was perfect knowledge. Okay, then you should be able to demonstrate that. We shouldn't be able to point to the Quran confusing different sources. There should be an accuracy in the use of language. But what I'm hearing from a lot of Muslims is, Allah chose not to do any of that. He didn't care enough to do those things. That's irrelevant to his purposes. It would seem to be a really strong argument, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be sort of like a foundational argument for your establishment of the authority of the Quran to be able to demonstrate how an unlearned man could accurately represent the beliefs of religions that he barely had any exposure to in any serious fashion? Wouldn't that be a great apologetic argument? But you don't make that apologetic argument because it's just not the case. And so, if you say to the Al-Injil, the people of the Injil, the gospel, you should judge amongst yourselves by what's contained in your sacred scriptures, the Injil, just as you said to the people of Moses, they should judge by what's in the Torah. How are they going to understand those words? Because if you anachronistically go, well, but the author of the Quran says that the Injil was given to Jesus, not to his apostles. And so the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, that can't be what the Injil actually is. You're assuming knowledge on the part of the author of the Quran that you've never even tried to establish. If the author of the Quran distinguished between those things, then you've got a point. He doesn't. Because when the author of the Quran speaks about Jesus, he draws from all sorts of non-canonical sources about Jesus, too, that are utterly ahistorical. And I'll be honest with you, when I see you guys trying to say, well, sure, yeah, this story is also found in these Gospels that were written 300-400 years later, and I see y'all trying to push the date back as far as possible, but look, for a bunch of that stuff, you can't push it back far enough. It is clearly before Muhammad, but it doesn't go back to Jesus. It isn't. It's apocryphal or Gnostic or semi-Gnostic or whatever. You know, we'd have to look at the specific citation to get real specific. But in both instances, in talking about Jesus' life, in talking about Moses, or talking about what we would call the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the author of the Quran shows great confusion or utter carelessness. I mean, if you're going to say, oh, he knew all about that stuff, well, it shows utter carelessness in the sources that are being cited. I think that indicates ignorance on the part of a prophet in Mecca and Medina who was unlettered and hence erred in his understanding. That's what it says to me. And so when you criticize me by saying, oh, we don't see, Old Testament, New Testament does not mean Torah and Injil, you are anachronistically taking modern definitions that have been developed within the the evolution of Islamic dawah today and reading them back into the Quran in such a way that what you fundamentally have to say is the people to whom these things were addressed. And there's all sorts of places where the al-kitab, the people, the book, sometimes it's Jews, sometimes it's Christians, sometimes it's both, are addressed by the author of the Quran. And evidently they weren't supposed to have a clue. No idea whatsoever as to what it actually meant. That turns your text into mishmash. And so that's probably not the best way to interpret your text. But something I needed to address, not so much, I mean, it's brought up right here, so I needed to address it, but it was presented by some other people in Facebook over the past couple of weeks.
We will explain that in a bit. So when we speak of corruption, we first need to understand and identify the stages of textual development. We need to distinguish between the different forms of a text because corruption does not merely start at one stage.
Now, I think it's very important that we identify what the word corruption means. Every written text until the photocopier experienced corruption. Is the Old Testament corrupted? Of course. It has textual variants. New Testament? Of course. Quran? Of course. And Ijaz has this book. He's read it. I've seen him comment on it on Facebook. So, textual variants? Yeah, they're listed right here. Right there in the book. You know this is, he knows this is the on a palimpsest transmission of the Quran in the first centuries. A.H. Numerous other books that we could address. It's well known that there are textual variants in the manuscripts of the Quran. Even if you don't use the palimpsests, there are textual variants. We know that. Every written document, every printed document undergoes corruption. The problem is people hear the term corruption, and many, both Christians and Muslims do this, and they assume that the word corruption means loss of the original, no longer usable as a means of communicating divine truth, etc., etc. That's not what it means. Corruption simply means that there is some kind of interruption at some point in the transmission of a text. And as long as you remember that texts are transmitted via many different avenues and channels, then, you know, I mean, there were literally thousands of manuscripts destroyed by the Romans during the persecution of Christians up till the peace of the church in AD 313. Does that mean the New Testament got lost there? No, we had thousands of manuscripts that survived, but thousands were destroyed. That would be a form of corruption. When a Roman soldier chucked someone's manuscript of the Gospel of John into a fire, that's textual corruption. That's the destruction of a witness. When Uthman ordered that anything but his version of the Quran be destroyed, that's textual corruption. No question about it. Which one's more important? Depends on how successful Uthman is. And this takes us back to the difference between the free transmission of the text, which we have in the New Testament, and the controlled transmission of the Quran. And it's also important to keep something else in mind. When you compare the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, with the Gospel, with the Quran, you are comparing apples and oranges amongst all three. There is a different methodology in the transmission of the Old Testament text than there is the New Testament text, and very different when it comes to the Quran. And you also have a massive age difference. Massive age difference. Let alone, there isn't anything for the Quran that even comes close to a little text like the Nasial 28th, let alone the ECM. So there's unfortunately, in a lot of Christian-Muslim dialogues, there's this glib comparison of these texts as if they're the same. Different sizes, different ages, different languages, multiple authors versus single authors. Far more information that we possess today about the manuscripts of the New Testament and even of the Old Testament than you have of the Quran. Lots of differences. Lots of differences. And unfortunately, that normally gets lost, and hence a lot of the examples that are given and things like that just aren't good examples at all. So things to keep in mind. I almost feel like clapping or jumping up and down or something to wake everybody else up right now, because I know that there are exactly 4 people in the audience that are glued to this, and everybody else is like,
Can happen throughout a document's lifetime. There does not need to be an intentional, malicious act of corruption. Good people can corrupt text without realizing it. So generally, there are 3 stages of development for any text. You have the initial writing, which we call the orthographic text. This is when the text is first being developed. Then you have the archetypal text. That is the text where the author intends to be published. And lastly, you have the codified and canonized text, better understood as the text that is known to readers and the public. So what...
Now, this is sort of drawing from, there's been a lot of discussion over the past, well, for a long time, but especially just over the past number of decades. You heard me when I was talking about CBGM, talking about the Ausgangs text. It's appropriate to make these distinctions, but you have to realize in 99% of any work, even today, the only thing that is ever available to us is the published text. I mean, I've written over 20 books, and probably some of the earlier ones on a 1.44 floppy in the other room someplace. I might have some of the earlier forms of those books in old Ventura publisher files or something like that. Yeah, probably no way of ever reading them again. But for the especially when it comes to the New Testament, you know, you'll read a lot of liberals, and what they'll do is they will hypothesize about stages of development in John's gospel or something like that. They have no manuscripts. They have no hard data. It's all theory. It's all theoretical. And you can do anything you want with it. And the problem is that's how you get published. I mean, you got to come up with something new to get published. And so it's a concept that unfortunately has been greatly abused and frequently just elevates pure speculation to some level of something else. But anyways, it is something that's discussed, but when it comes to actual documentation, now you do get some insights. For example, in Hadith, I reproduced a citation in the Hadith about a section that where it was said that it was caused to be forgotten. Certain verses of the Quran caused to be forgotten. Well, that would come in this area of initial text and archetypal text and then published text. This would be what, between initial text and archetypal text, and a supernatural intervention to remove something that was once there. That would be one way of bringing data in to look at that from that perspective. There is another religious book where we do actually get, because it's so new, we do get an insight into this. It's the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon. We have the 1830 Book of Mormon, but now we've got printers' manuscripts, and we actually have a way of really shining a lot of light on initial text, archetypal, published, changes, you know, those lost 116 pages. Was it 116 pages? I think it was 116. Sounds right. I think it was 116 pages, something like that. But that's obviously so modern, so recent, that it's explains why we have that kind of information. But yeah, it's out there. It's interesting stuff. Let's see a question before I get back to Ijaz here. I'm sure James talked about it somewhere. If anyone knows where, links are appreciated. But how do Muslims address the Uthman issue? They've addressed it in numerous different ways. I've gotten all sorts of different answers over the years as to Uthman and what he did and why he did it and so on and so forth. So there's actually numerous responses to that. Let us press forward here as time is short.
We learned today is that at each of these stages of textual development, both the Old and New Testaments have experienced significant and meaningful changes. So just going to point out something.
Now, it'll be interesting to look at what Ijaz means by changes. Because what he's basically going to do is he's going to point to something well known to seminary students and people, like things that we've addressed in the past here. There wasn't anything new here, but it is an area that is useful for Muslims because the vast majority of Christians, including Christian apologists, do not deal with this. And that is specifically citations of the Old Testament in the New, and the issue of the difference between the Hebrew Masoretic stream, the stream of witnesses in the Greek Septuagint, and the utilization of the Greek Septuagint where it differs from the Hebrew Masoretic in the citation between when the New Testament writers are citing the Old Testament. And so those of you who've listened to this program for a long time, you know that we've addressed this many, many times. But it is not the kind of thing that you're going to get normally. And when I preached through Hebrews, we had to deal with a couple major examples of this. And if in 5 to 10% of Christian sermons on those same texts there was any reference to this, I'd be shocked. Because there are a few things more difficult to try to deal with in the context of a sermon than this kind of subject. And it's much, much better for a classroom. It's much better for a Bible study. It's much better for a webcast. It's really, really tough in a 40-minute sermon. And so a lot of folks just never get actually exposed to it. And that's why it's useful from an Islamic perspective. But of course, by us talking about it, we're going to try to reduce its usefulness by shining more light on it so you see what's really going on.
Yeah. When Alex brought the argument about similarity, he's focusing on the last part of a text's development. So he skipped 2/3 of the way and jumped right to the end. Now, just looking at this, though, the only place that you're going to have actual documentable evidence is over here. You're not going to, outside of something like that, applying this to the Quran, the hadith about the section of the Quran that was caused to be forgotten, or some witness from an early writer that said, I used to hear Muhammad and he would recite this verse differently. That's the only way you could get back into this area at all. You certainly can't get back here at all. But when it comes to the New Testament, I can't imagine how you can even address these things from a documentable perspective. Theoretical perspective, I suppose, but not from a documentary perspective. To illustrate this, this is a quick chart. You have the initial text, you have the middle part, and then you have the published text. What Alex focuses on in his opening dialogue is just those three things at the end. He skipped 90% of what we should be examining, And today I'm going to be demonstrating that.
Now, this is interesting because there is an appropriate distinction to be made between examining textual variation in manuscripts and the transmission of the text as it was distributed. So getting back to the Ausgangs text, anything else, again, is going to be theoretical. It's going to be, well, and in this case, what he really ends up coming up with is, well, these corruptions are things where you could argue that the New Testament writers are misunderstanding the Old Testament text and not being fair with the Old Testament text. That's not the same thing as corruption. We have to be very careful with the terminology as we're using it here and use it specifically. And I think sometimes some terms got used in context they might not be best to be used in.
So this is another way to understand it, a much more elaborate form of the text. So we're just going to jump ahead here a bit quickly. So what you will learn today, at present, there is a 1,000-year or more difference in time between the age of Moses and the Old Testament that we have today. However, we do not need to argue that corruption took 1,000 years. In fact, as the Old Testament itself testifies, whatever was given to Moses could have been corrupted the moment the commandments were given to the Israelites. In Exodus chapter 28, verses 3 to 4, we read that right after the Israelites were saved by God from the Egyptians, that they were taught what God told Moses, and they affirmed that they would believe in what God said and commanded. So it says, Moses came and told the people all the Lord's words and all the decisions. All the people answered together, "We are willing to do all the words that the Lord has said." And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. So what happened next? They knew not to worship false gods or idols. That's the end of the story. There's no need for this dialogue then. But that's not the case. The Old Testament testifies that when Moses went to receive the commandments from God, and he took too long to return to them, the Israelites immediately decided to worship a golden calf. And this is what Exodus chapter 32 verse 1 indicates. When the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Get up, make us gods that will go before us." So as you can see, you don't need 1,000 years for corruption of God's words for the Israelites.
Now, I'm running out of time, but I'll stop right there. I'm a little confused, and he's going to continue on and to basically point to the sinfulness of mankind and say mankind can be so sinful that it's obvious that he could have corrupted the scriptures. Well, I don't see that as much of an argument, to be perfectly honest with you. Muslims are just as sinful as anybody else. Doesn't that mean that the Quran could have been corrupted? I mean, Muslims believe that Allah can protect the text of the Quran. Why couldn't he protect the text given to Moses? And in fact, it would seem to me that's what the author of the Quran thought in Surah 5. Again, you know, Torah to Moses, Injil to Jesus, Quran to Muhammad. It's a chain. It's sort of an exegetical thing. But just because the people entered into idolatry, why does that mean that God would allow his word to be corrupted? You accept Jesus as a Rasul of Allah, and Jesus quoted from Moses, and even to the point of holding men accountable for what was said 1,400 years later, as if 1,400 years earlier, as if God had spoken to them, and based his argument upon the tense of a verb. Seems that Jesus felt that there had been an appropriate transmission of that text sufficient to hold men accountable. So I don't see the connection. I mean, men have been sinful. What does that have to do with the corruption of the Word of God? That's not an argument. I mean, I can point to terrible things that were done in the early years after the giving of the Quran. Does that mean I would have a basis for saying the Quran has been corrupted? Just looking for some consistency at that particular